Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Educating the New Congress. This is the first of a step-by-step advocacy training series that SchoolHouse Connection is hosting specifically for homeless educators and for service providers. And again, today is part one. So without further ado, I want to just share a little bit, again, for those of you who are new to SchoolHouse Connection. We are a national organization working to overcome homelessness through education. We do that through policy advocacy at the state and the federal level and a lot of technical assistance. My name is Barbara Duffield. I am the Executive Director of SchoolHouse Connection. I've been engaged in this work for more than 25 years, and most of it focusing on federal policy advocacy. And I'm thrilled today to introduce Alian Anderson, SchoolHouse Connection's Policy and Outreach Associate.
Thank you, Barbara. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, and thank you for joining us. As Barbara mentioned, my name is Alian Anderson, and I serve as the Policy and Outreach Associate for SchoolHouse Connection. I started working for SHC last year. Prior to that, I had experience working at the local, state, and federal level, working in the Office of the Mayor Pro Tem in Houston, working in the Texas legislature during the 86th legislative session, and also interning for Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson last year. So getting to see like all different levels. I'm so excited to be with you all today, and thank you again for joining us.
Great. And also we are thrilled today we have special guest presenters from Education Council, Jamie Fastow and Emily Webb, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, I'm so delighted to be here today. I'm Jamie Fastow with Education Council. I have had the great pleasure of working with Barbara for almost 2 decades on these issues, starting when I worked with Patty Murray. I also worked with her when I was on the House side working for Congressman George Miller, and this is my most favorite issue I've ever gotten to work on.
And I'm Emily Webb. I'm also from the Ed Council team where I work with Jamie, and I've had the opportunity to work with SchoolHouse for the past several years. Prior to joining the team at Ed Council, I worked as a fellow with Senator Durbin's office. And I started my career and my passion for education as a high school teacher in Denver, Colorado. I'm so excited to be here though today with all of you.
Great. So a little bit about our advocacy series. As I said, we're kicking it off today. This is a 6-part series. We know that particularly if you are in a school district working with McKinney-Vento students or an early childhood program or higher ed, or maybe you're a service provider, that you may get alerts from SchoolHouse Connection or other organizations, and it may seem intimidating, or perhaps it's something you've been involved in a little bit and you want to get more involved with. So what we thought we'd do is sort of break it down in 6 modules or sessions. A basic session today. Next week, we'll look at how to effectively communicate with congressional offices and have 2 current staffers as special guests to give the pro tips. We'll look a little bit at some case studies about what successful advocacy looks like at the state and federal level. Then we're excited also to have specialists from Rally, an advocacy-oriented communications firm, join us for the 4th one about using media and social media as a tool for advocacy. We will also have Yori from National Network for Youth and our own Jordan do a session on how to effectively and ethically engage young people and parents with lived experience in advocacy. And then we'll close out our 6th series with some how to take all of this and apply it closer to home in state policy advocacy. But for today, I'm going to turn it over to Alian to let you know what's on tap for today's agenda.
Thank you, Barbara. So a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So of course, this webinar is entitled Getting Grounded in the New Congress. But the first thing that we're going to cover is why are we here at all? Why are we here today? Why does advocacy matter? So we're going to be making the case for constituent engagement and just delving a little into why it's so important for your members of Congress and your senators to hear directly from you. Then we're going to discuss the difference between advocacy and lobbying, because I know that some of our attendees today may be working for school districts and may have concerns about whether or not they can even be communicating with members of Congress due to fears of like lobbying restrictions. But we're going to definitely discuss that there is a clear difference that we'll learn about a little more. We're also going to be discussing the unique dynamics of the 117th Congress, because I'm sure we all know so much has changed at the federal level within the past couple of months, and that gives us so much greater of an opportunity for advocacy, and we're so excited and it's very energizing. So one of the reasons why we even wanted to do this today. Then we're also going to cover what's at stake for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness during this critical time. We're going to discuss the most likely opportunities that you can have to conduct impactful advocacy in the 117th. And also we're going to have a couple of call to actions of like what you can do now and how you can immediately apply the lessons that you're learning in this webinar and the remainder of the installments for the series to actual practice. So we're gonna jump right into it. Why advocate? So a lot of you guys, as I mentioned, you may be working for school districts, you may be a making event liaison yourself, you may be a provider, but no matter your position, you are the voice. You can be the voice for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness, and also for yourselves to discuss like the challenges that you have been facing, that they have been facing, especially during this time, and communicate your needs, like from the horse's mouth. You also have a unique knowledge and a unique perspective that policymakers, they can do as much reading as they can, but it is so much more impactful and so different to hear what's actually happening on the ground and what people are seeing today and right now. I'm gonna pass to Barbara.
Another really important reason, and again, if you're on this webinar, then we have a sense that you know it's important, but I think one thing that is perhaps less clear is that in the world of Washington, D.C. advocacy, there may be organizations who are, say, for example, speaking on issues of homelessness, but they may not exactly represent your views. SchoolHouse Connection, a big part of our principle of advocacy is grassroots, listening and learning before we advocate. But there may be other organizations that have the word homelessness in the title. So for example, they may take a position on an issue like HUD's definition of homelessness. And people on the Hill say, oh, here's a homelessness organization, and they don't think HUD's definition should change. They think it should stay the way it is. It's meeting the needs. Whereas you may have a very different experience. So to be able to communicate concerns directly and not rely on other state or national organizations to represent what you see and what you know to be true is really critical, and it only happens if you're directly involved. Again, we do our best at SchoolHouse Connection with the grassroots orientation, but we do that in partnership with you. And I know Jamie and Emily have their own perspectives from their experiences, both when they were working on the Hill and now working with other organizations about sort of why this piece is just so important. And we're going to get into the tactics about how, but we just want to really underscore this piece about the why.
Thanks, Barbara. There isn't enough to underscore about this point, and sharing your perspective. It's also relationship building with critical offices so that you become a resource for offices as they're trying to deeply understand the impacts of different issues or needed changes. I have countless examples from when I was negotiating bills on the Hill and just making sure that folks had shared understanding of what challenges were being faced and allowed us to have conversations about how to create the right policy solution for the moment. But it did require us to have that on the ground information about needed changes.
For sure, and just quickly building off of what Jamie was sharing, I think that it also helps create an opportunity to show that this isn't just a challenge in one district or in one state, but really this is a challenge in multiple locations across the country. And so while you may be speaking to a representative or a member from your office or on certain committees, it helps expand the knowledge across many offices about the impact that children and youth and families experiencing homelessness and it may be having and what their needs are or what your needs are as liaisons or as individuals who work with those children and families.
Great, and I can say too, you know, the difference for us as a national organization, when even if we just can see a constituent and the speed of the response and the likelihood that we get a response is like night and day. So that constituent engagement, it facilitates our work as national advocates as well. Next, moving on here, I'll turn it back over to Alian.
Thank you, Barbara. So we're going to take a second to discuss citizen-centric advocacy. And under that, we're going to be discussing a report that was done by the Congressional Management Foundation back in 2019. So CMF is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that focuses their work on strengthening the relationship between Congress and the people that it serves. And they're very research-based. So basically, some of the findings that they found while doing different like surveys on congressional staffers, constituent interactions have more influence or the most influence on lawmakers like decision making than so many other advocacy strategies. It's really been shown to be one of the most powerful ways of getting your lawmaker to take like a firm decision on an issue. Congress generally places like a high value on groups and citizens who've built relationships with legislators and their staff, and definitely don't forget about their staff. Relationships are, I'm sure Jamie and Emily can speak to this as well. They're so important in advocacy. Like even Barbara saying, like even just CCing you on an email and getting them familiar with your name, knowing that, oh, these are the providers in my district, then who knows, in some cases, there'll be some times when like a bill comes up on an issue related to your specific area of work, and they might try to refer to you and say, hey, what do you think about this bill? Like, how would this help you? Or just even you offering that without them even soliciting it, letting them know like how important these things would help, how important these things would be for you and your community. It goes so far. Citizens, like, and another point of that, like building off of that, providing personalized and local information to Congress is also so important. I saw that a lot in my work in the state legislature and also in Congress, where getting even something as simple as fact sheets or just a simple statistic from your district, it makes them pay more attention to the issue and makes them want to do more, because of course they're directly responsible for those within their district, like their constituents, whether it is a youth representative or a senator. So that's also extremely important and extremely impactful. And another great thing is that citizens have the potential to always be enhancing their advocacy skills and to influence Congress. One of the reasons why you all are here today, I'm sure, is to enhance your own advocacy skills or just to get more information on it. And so there's always ways to get better and to be even more impactful. And we're figuring that out all the time. So the next thing that I want to show you all is this graphic from their report. It's from a survey conducted by CMF again, of a bipartisan group of staffers. And the question was, if your member or senator has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And then closer to the bottom, we see where visits from lobbyists, which includes groups like SchoolHouse Connection, they do have some amount of influence. But I mean, look at the in-person visits from constituents and the contact from constituent reps. It has so much positive influence, and because like this is just to underscore everything that we were saying before. It really makes so much of a difference. Just in case you have ever thought of advocacy, or maybe even if you haven't before, but you just kind of felt like, will my voice really make a difference? I hope that this is the thing that knocks you in your head and lets you know, yes, it really does make a difference. It really does mean so much to these persons in Washington. And yeah, it just makes so much of a difference just to hear your voice. Next slide, and then I will pass it over to Barbara.
So this is one we definitely want to touch on, because we hear a lot concerns about, well, I'm not allowed to lobby, or I don't think I'm allowed to lobby, or I've been told I can't lobby. Sometimes that's because you work for a nonprofit and there are rules about lobbying. Sometimes it may be because, you know, it's a school district has a rule about having some contact with congressional offices. So just to be very clear here, these work together, and advocacy in many ways is much more important than lobbying and has a bigger impact. And the concerns about lobbying really can be minimized if you understand the differences. Advocacy very broadly is any activity to influence policy. That can be just basic educating. And we title this whole series Educating the New Congress, because that's really what needs to happen, is educating the new Congress. So this means sharing information on the issues, data and information, and also arguing the cause, the impact of a policy or a resource for better or worse. So even if it's, for example, as we'll talk about later, the Biden COVID relief package, what impact would it have the way it is structured now? Sharing that information is advocacy, it's education, actually, more than lobbying. Lobbying is asking legislators to take a position on the specific piece of legislation or urging others to do the same. So that's actually the definition from the IRS for nonprofits. So just to make this a little bit clearer with some examples, advocacy, and then again, this is focusing this next case on the definition of homelessness that HUD has versus the definition that education has, which is a continual issue, including now during the pandemic. So advocacy is explaining to congressional staff that many families and youth don't meet HUD's definition. They're still vulnerable, but they can be excluded from help because they're not prioritized or they're not even eligible. Sharing what that looks like in your community. These are the situations of doubled up or motel families, what it actually is like in terms of their vulnerability. Making the point that if there were flexible funding available to meet their needs, that this particular population, it would prevent harm and help stabilize them, and then giving an example of what that could be done. So for example, you know, I'm a liaison, I get a call on a Friday from a family, they have nowhere to go. If I had flexible funds to put them in a motel for 3 days or help with utilities or emergency childcare, we could stabilize that family. All of that's advocacy. Lobbying is please sign on as a co-sponsor to S2220, the Emergency Family Stabilization Act. Both of these things are important, but the first piece of it really lends itself to the second piece of it, and you can always do the education piece. Another quick example, this is again speaking to a very current issue that we'll talk about in a couple of slides. You know, for the COVID relief dollars, whether it's CARES Act or ESSER that happened at the end of the school year, those education dollars have not been targeted to students experiencing homelessness in the same way they have after past disasters. And without having requirements to target money directly to McKinney-Vento students, they still face barriers, to very basic barriers. And for example, just explaining that amount and localizing it is advocacy. Lobbying, please support at least $500 million in dedicated funding for homeless students in the next relief package. If we're at a meeting, you saying, doing the advocacy, and a group like SchoolHouse Connection or another's making the specific pitch is a perfect way to combine these two in a way that gets the information, the education to Congress, but also sort of addresses that specific concern that you may have around lobbying. And I'm going to turn it over to Jamie and Emily to talk a little bit about some of the spaces for this and ways to consider these two pieces in your own advocacy and line of work.
Great. So even after hearing these examples, we recognize that there's a chance that folks may still have some concerns about lobbying and advocacy and which one that they're doing. And so we do want to underscore that advocacy really is just as powerful as lobbying, and that even if where you work has restrictions on contact with congressional offices, that there are still ways that you can advocate while remaining respectful of those restrictions. And so within that, it involves examples like what Barbara just walked through related to providing information to educate congressional staff about the impact of a policy. And I think that one is particularly powerful because sometimes there are concerns from folks who want to advocate that they may not have the exact right answer, or they may not know the exact way that Congress should take this information and change it into something that better supports those needs that they're elevating to eliminate those needs. And so just by providing the information about where needs might exist or where there are challenges in the way that the system is currently operating can help inform policies to moving forward to help alleviate some of those challenges. And so the advocacy there is critical. You also can find others to help make the ask, like SchoolHouse Connection, who does phenomenal advocacy work, or nonprofit community partners or other organizations who may have aligned priorities with yours. And then you are still a private citizen, a private individual. So even in that capacity, in that role, you can reach out to your members of Congress and you can share what you're feeling and what you need to better support you, both in your role as a private citizen and in your areas where you see need within your community or within your state.
Great.
I was just going to add one more point on that last slide, Barbara, and it's the relationship between the groups on the call and liaisons and SchoolHouse Connection. So if you remember back to Alian's slide showing the effectiveness of each of the different actions, SchoolHouse is a really effective advocacy organization because it has connectivity to the field and can draw up those real stories, real impact on families, and point to people on the ground experiencing the challenges that require the need at the federal level. And so the relationship between those two things is just as important as the individual asks. And on this, so I know, we all exist in Washington, D.C., and it feels like so much has changed dramatically, and yet so much is still really hard. And so obviously we've had a change in the White House, and Democrats now control both chambers in the House as well as the administration. And what that means isn't that they're magic. It means that they can set an agenda, which allows for different conversations and different debates to take place. Given the closeness of both the House and Senate splits, it still requires very deep advocacy to accomplish goals, and including on both sides of the aisle. Because there are school districts in every congressional district, and sadly, there are homeless children and families in every congressional district, this issue tends to be bipartisan. So no one should feel that if they're calling an office, it's falling on deaf ears. And even when it does fall on those deaf ears, it is still helpful for those who are trying to drive the change to at least have that ground softened by that shared knowledge. And so ensuring that despite the control of one party across all of these entities, the advocacy is still very critical.
And building on what Jamie was sharing about the dynamics of the 117th Congress, we have a couple other points that are important to drive home. The first of which is that pandemic priorities really are shaped by both the executive and the legislative branch. Starting first with the executive branch, in January, as Barbara and Alian shared earlier, President Biden unveiled the American Rescue Plan, which is a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. And really, this plan is just a plan at this point. It's not a law, but it has served as a clear marker of the elements that the executive branch and that President Biden want to see in whatever package is produced by Congress on COVID relief. And President Biden's proposed plan includes $170 billion for education. That include dedicated K through 12 and higher education funds, as well as funding related to childcare and to helping support to keep some childcare providers open who may be on the verge of closure as a result of the pandemic. But this plan does not yet include, President Biden's plan did not include any dedicated funding for children and youth experiencing homelessness. And so that's a big opportunity, and particularly for their education. And so that's a big opportunity for advocacy. As the legislative branch, moving into the second part of that bullet point, as the legislative branch is now working to pass a COVID relief package. And we anticipate that this will occur relatively quickly, unclear on exactly when or what will be in it as talks are ongoing. But things will become clear as days continue to go by, and there has been progress made in the House, and now it is over to the Senate for a lot of the work, and there will be additional detail on that as we continue through the presentation. But as part of this development of the relief package, Congress really is weighing the needs of various groups. And we know that the pandemic has impacted everybody in different ways and in different depths, but this pandemic has impacted everybody. And so that means that there are a lot of people, especially in the human service sector, who are in need of support and who are in need of relief right now. And so we anticipate that, and we know that there are lots of different groups advocating, which really underscores the need for continued advocacy and continued voices from the field for supporting children and youth experiencing homelessness because of the significant need that we know that exists within that community.
And Emily, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. You're fading in and out a little bit volume-wise. We just had a comment, so I don't know, maybe if you could scoot closer to your mic.
Definitely, I'm happy to. I hope that that helps a little bit. Wonderful. And so really, as things continue to move forward, we also know that when Congress starts to move, things can move very quickly. And so it really is important to be ready for action and to continue advocating throughout this process so that your voices can be heard and so that the needs of children and youth experiencing homelessness can be recognized as part of this legislation moving forward.
Great. Aliane.
Okay. Thank you. So the next thing is, what is at stake for children, youth, and families who are experiencing homelessness? As Jamie and Barbara were talking about earlier, SchoolHouse Connection is a grassroots organization. So it's so important to us, like in our advocacy, to hear what's going on the ground. And we also share these stories with members of Congress. Some of the things that we've heard so far are the increased mobility of children, youth, and families, persons who are in motels or doubled up situations, persons who aren't protected by eviction moratoria. In some areas, we've actually heard of increases in evictions from last year to this year, up to 50% in increases in some regions. We've also seen where many students who are experiencing homelessness, like children and youth, have gone unidentified for the 2020 to 2021 school year, which means that they're also disconnected not only from school, but the important services that they typically receive through the McKinney-Vento program. But while we have all of this, we also definitely want to hear from you all what you've been seeing, just in case anyone has been seeing anything different. Maybe some people have been seeing, maybe there are two people in this webinar who've been seeing the same thing, the same unique thing happening in their community. So I encourage everyone to just pop over to the chat box or the Q&A box. And if you want to just go ahead and share some of the things that you have been seeing in your community, like on the ground where you are, we would definitely love to hear that, because it's so important to know like what's actually going on.
And part of the reason why we're going over this too, sort of the issues that are specifically facing children and youth and families experiencing homelessness, is because Congress is making decisions that will impact all of the bullets on the previous slide. We just had a great question in the Q&A pane, which is sort of which is more effective, to follow this path of congressional advocacy at the federal level or contacting city and county officials. And they're both important. For the federal policy, these are the sorts of decisions that get shaped at the federal level. Certainly the amount of funds available. So whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about annual funds for federal programs, that's determined at the federal level. If and how funds are targeted to specific populations, that also happens at the federal level. What are the eligibility rules for people and programs? So we've certainly seen, for example, with the Emergency Solutions Grant and COVID, that some of the eligibility rules, some of the ways the funds were distributed proved to be barriers. So some of those eligibility rules, both for people, but also what can you use funds for, that can be determined at the federal level and often is for federal aid. And then also instructions to federal agencies for how aid is delivered or carried out, or what needs to be done. So for example, we saw in the last package for COVID relief signed before the end of the year that states have to report about use of funds to address learning loss in specific populations, and homeless students are mentioned. So something like that, while it's not the same as targeted funding, at least it's an instruction to states and federal agencies about how that's carried out. So that's at the federal level, but to get back to the question about city and county, you can also ask city and county people to contact federal representatives. So if you have a relationship there, if they get a call from a state rep, a city council member, a school board member, somebody like that who is close to you and is better positioned to talk to members of Congress, that can be a great way to connect those two strategies. So it's kind of great timing for that question, and I thought I would answer it in by way of this particular slide. And I will turn it back over now to Jamie and Emily.
Definitely. So we're going to look at what's going on right now in Congress. And then going from there, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to get a little bit more in depth on budget reconciliation, which is one of the things going on right now in Congress, and also why these provide opportunities for federal help for children, youth, and families experiencing homelessness. And so, like I said, budget reconciliation is happening right now, as the slide shows you. Very briefly, budget reconciliation is a vehicle that allows, in a limited fashion, allows Congress to advance legislation with a simple majority. It's currently a process in use for the COVID relief package, but like I said, Jamie will get more in depth on budget reconciliation, as I'm sure it's a word that you may have heard in the news over the past couple of weeks. Additionally, other areas that will provide opportunities include the annual appropriations process. And with the annual appropriations process, Congress will be working on the fiscal year 2022 appropriations bill to fund the federal government, which includes the agencies, federally funded programs, among others. And a lot of the advocacy in this process really takes place in the spring and summer. So in the coming months. And new appropriations bills really are supposed to be completed before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. However, supposed to is key in that sentence. A lot of the time, Congress may not have completed an appropriations package or may not have been able to reach an agreement on an appropriations package by that date, which ultimately frequently leads to relying on a continuing resolution to fund programs until an agreement is reached, or potentially for the next year, for the following fiscal year. And so the appropriations process will be informed by a budget that President Biden will release following his joint session speech, which will likely take place in March or potentially early April. But it's also informed by the work of advocates and by what advocates say is needed on the ground, and where funding may or may not be working or not reaching, or reaching the right participants. So it can be both positive advocacy of this is really working for us and this is helpful, in addition to saying this is not working for us or we need additional support in a different area. There may be some other possibilities of either additional COVID relief, childcare specific bills, or higher education bills. But right now, we really think the COVID package and the appropriations bills will likely be the majority of the legislation that moves through in the coming months and year.
Great.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, reconciliation is both a very simple and overly complicated process. It has a lot of rules around what kind of language can be in the bill. But the helpful part for the Senate, especially given the dynamics that we discussed earlier, is it does just require a simple majority and can't be filibustered. So you don't need the 60 votes that we often hear about in the Senate. With that said, it's largely a process where authorizing committees versus your regular appropriators, which are the money committees, come up with savings across existing programs and redirect them to whatever their priorities may be. I think the conversation around reconciliation is additionally complicated because we've had a series of recovery bills that have moved through that have both been substantial but insufficient, and the timing has been off to need on the ground. And so the needs through a reconciliation process are extensive. On timing, and then we can get into a little bit of the content, the House has started their process. The Senate had impeachment to deal with, and we'll be turning back to dealing with reconciliation shortly. We do expect everything to be wrapped up by mid-March, and as is noted on the slide, because of unemployment insurance benefits. Reality is, to Emily's point on what Congress should be doing versus does, timing may slide there. UI could all be extended outside of reconciliation, but this is what folks are aiming at. It's, as you can see here, $130 billion in K-12 education. Aliana, if you want to move us forward.
That's me, hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Barbara, do you want to move us forward? I guess Aliana does not want to move us forward. You can see here the bulk of funding that we're looking at across these programs. I would say here too, there's as Barbara alluded to earlier per the great question we got from in the chat, this is also a place where it's really important to be communicating with your local officials. There is governor's funds, for example, in the CARES packages, the governors have a lot of flexibility on how they spend it out. there's going to be a lot of choices that are made. We'll talk about advocacy to the Department of Ed shortly, on the ground about how this money is spent, and being really clear at multiple levels of your system, including your district and your state, on what needs you see will help shape and inform how this money flows down. I also anticipate we'll have a second reconciliation bill later this year. There's some bifurcating on their purposes in the Congress, but it's not worth going into now. And the only other point I would make here is your advocacy now is expectation setting for the next conversation. So even if it feels like, oh my gosh, we didn't make progress this time, I promise you are table setting and ground softening for the next conversation.
Thanks very much, Jamie. So again, like now is really a vital time, and there'll be, you know, action all year, but we are both shaping current legislation and preparing for future legislation at this moment. The funding totals that you have on this slide are from bills that were passed out of committees last week in the House. These are tied to the Biden's American Rescue Plan, and you can see sort of the big pictures here. Later in the week, we'll have more details. The only piece I want to note here before talking a little bit more about education is that for the HUD homeless programs, so the second to the last and the third to the last bullets, it looks like the Congress is doing something a little bit different, where they're not going through emergency solutions grant because it's a lot of the problems that have been there. It'll be important to pay attention to the details, because if you read the bills, they'll say, oh, the HUD definition of homelessness is eligible, at risk of homelessness is eligible, but how HUD actually implements that at-risk piece is going to be tricky. So just a point there in case you hear or read that, oh, this is going to be funding that's available both to HUD definition and ed definition. We're going to need to be very vigilant about that. And moving on here, the big piece here right now in this particular moment is the fact that of the $130 billion for K-12 education, there was no targeting specifically for students experiencing homelessness. That was also true for students with disabilities, for English learners. So there's a very vague sentence about learning loss and meeting needs and responding to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on specific student groups. But what we know, based on our experience talking to you and our surveys, is that if there isn't specific targeting, it does not necessarily reach and is likely not to reach our students experiencing homelessness. So here's a right now item, which is telling your members of Congress, your US representatives and your US senators, that the COVID education relief dollars must be specifically targeted to students experiencing homelessness. The red text here in the slide is a sample email message that you can take and you can personalize and you can localize, but this is basically the message to send to your congressional offices. What we decided to do, given the need for speed right here, is to make things even easier to facilitate this advocacy. So sometimes, you know, we'll have, like, you'll go to a website and it'll say, like, there's a message you can put in your zip code and it'll give you your US rep, and then you edit the template and then you hit send and it goes off. Right now we need to get to the right people. So what we've done is that second link there is actually a contact sheet for the staffers in Congress who handle education. There's a one tab for US Senate and there's one tab for US House of Representatives. So if you click there and you look up your congressional district or your state, you'll get the actual names and email addresses. Know that this changes. There's like over 500 offices, so it's changing on a regular basis. But the action item here is to send them an email with that previous message. And again, assuming that that's a concern where you live, and localize it so that they know right now, as these conversations are happening, that there needs to be better targeting for our students experiencing homelessness. Of course, you may already have a relationship with your congressional office. And in that case, if you know somebody at the district level, you know, please also loop them into the conversation so that they know that you're talking to the DC office and to the right staffer, and they'll redirect you if it needs to get to somebody else. But that is a current action item for today, tomorrow, and the next day, as this is moving pretty quickly. And I'll turn it over to Aliane to talk about a second action item.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So I'm really excited to speak to you all today about the Emergency Family Stabilization Act, or something that we lovingly call EFSA. So what this legislation will do is it creates a new flexible emergency funding stream that's going to be dispersed to the Administration for Children and Families, or the ACF, at the Department of Health and Human Services. It's going to provide direct, dedicated funding to meet the unique needs of children, youth, and families who are experiencing homelessness under the education definition. So it's going to be prioritizing those who have previously been left out of other COVID relief efforts before this, like through other HUD homeless assistance efforts. The funding is going to be available through subgrants for community-based organizations and also local educational agencies. So if you work at a school, your school would also be eligible to apply for subgrants through EFSA. It's going to be funding that's federal to local, so that each community will be able to attend to the specific needs of your specific community. So EFSA was reintroduced just a couple weeks ago by a bipartisan group of senators, 11 senators in total, which is actually more than twice the amount of introductory senators from the last session when it was first introduced in the 116th Congress. So that already tells you the type of train that we're on. The new bill number is S220. So when you are reaching out to your senator or your member of Congress, as we are hoping to get a House companion as well in the coming weeks, then that's what you can use. But of course, the House is going to have a different number. So in terms of action items, next slide, please. So something you can do right now. So at SchoolHouse Connection, we're always trying to find different ways to allow persons to engage in meaningful advocacy. One of the ways is we actually have a platform right here. I will send a link in the chat as well, where you can not only send tweets to your senator that we already have pre-written for you, basically urging them to support this bill and letting them know all the benefits, the wonderful benefits of EFSA. It also allows you to find the phone numbers for their office in case you prefer to just make a quick phone call, but you can also send a customizable letter. So the letter template is already there for you. The tweets are already there. All you have to do is put in your zip code and it will instantly match you to your respective senator and representative. And you can fill this in with personalized or localized information, as Barbara was saying, just to let them know, like, this is directly coming from a constituent and this is what's happening. This is why we need this right now. Another thing you can do is we can connect you to the right staffer. Of course, we have the sheet as well, but feel free to also email me. I am more than willing to try to connect you with the staffer to also set up meetings. You can use this form that's linked. I will also be sending that in the chat in a bit, where you can just let us know a little bit about yourself, and then I will just match you to the correct staffer, the education staffer, family staffer in the corresponding senatorial or congressional office, so that we can let them know, like, this is something that you need and this is something that we need now. This is something that needs to be a priority, and for them to also sign on as a co-sponsor for the legislation. And I just want to add that the same link with the letter and the tweets, it only takes a couple of seconds. It's super quick. We've mentioned this in past webinars and persons have completed it before I even finished the slide, just to show you how quick and easy it is. So yeah, if you even want to take a look at it while we're here, then that is a-okay. Next slide, please. So the next thing we want to talk about is fiscal year 22 appropriations. So that will be coming up, but we are expecting that to come like a little bit further down the line, because Congress, which, as we know, has been nicknamed the broken branch, only focuses on one thing at a time, really. So while we're focusing on budget reconciliation right now, we still definitely do have in the back of our minds the fiscal 22 appropriation. So we're kind of just trying to prep them and let them know, like, these are the things that we're advocating for. So the first thing is the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Program, or EHCY, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. In fiscal year 2021, we received a $106.5 million appropriation, which is just a very slight increase. I believe it's a 1.83% increase from fiscal year 2020. And at the current funding level, less than 1 in 4 districts receives a subgrant, receives a McKinney-Vento subgrant, which is something that we definitely need to change. And because of that, our our fiscal year 2022 request is $300 million to ensure that more LEAs are able to receive the subgrants and provide students experiencing homelessness with the appropriate services that they need. The second ask is for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, or RHYA. So in fiscal year 2021, it received a $136.7 million appropriation. But the fiscal year 2022 request is $165 million to better address the needs and provide the foundational support for youth and young adults who are experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is yet another opportunity for you all to exercise the things that you're learning today. So last year, we actually had what's called a Dear Colleague letter, which is basically a request from champions of an issue, in this case for EHCY and RHYA, to send to other members of Congress, asking them to sign on to this letter to basically show support for the programs included. So this would be them, like, once members sign on to a Dear Colleague letter asking for increased funding for EHCY and RHYA, it shows, like, the more members that we have signed on to Dear Colleague letters, the more it shows leadership and like the chair or the ranking members of the appropriations committees, how much it shows how much support this issue has and how needed and wanted it is by other members of Congress, which is it's super impactful when you're trying to get different policies passed. So one thing is we want everyone to look out for a future action alert coming from SchoolHouse Connection, basically to urge your respective senators or House representatives to sign on to the Dear Colleague letters once they're being circulated. And as I said again, just to emphasize one more time, the more members that sign on, the more support it signals to the chairs and the more likely they are to include it and to actually give the increases within the appropriations. So yeah, we definitely want everyone to get involved in that, and stay tuned.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about Congress because that's the title of this series, Educating the New Congress. But it's also important in this moment in time to understand that we have a new administration, and that's another way to influence federal policy. So we wanted to be sure to just take a couple seconds here to talk about the importance of federal agencies and the different ways that they are shaping federal policy. And I'll turn it over to Jamie and Emily to talk a little bit about this.
Thanks, Barbara. Yes, I mean, the federal agencies make an enormous number of decisions every day about the uses of funds, how money goes out the door, what priorities are. And so engaging there is critical as well. And I think for this group, the Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, and the U.S. Department of Ed are your core foci. There are lots of different ways to engage there, including, as you see here, public comments on regulations. I imagine this administration is going to be holding, on the Department of Ed side, many more stakeholder meetings and calls. The last administration did an enormous amount of work with stakeholders under the Administration on Children and Families, including with SchoolHouse. And then the Dear Colleagues at the agencies, there's a form of regulations, there's also guidance that goes down that is nudging folks in the right direction on how policy should be interpreted from Congress. And this is just another place where the connectivity to SchoolHouse is so critical, because Barbara and her team will be a resource for the U.S. Department of Ed and ACF on understanding the field. There will be meetings that they likely hold around the country, populating those, like all of those sorts of things are really ways that advocacy happens. So making sure that those stories are coming into SchoolHouse, that those opportunity points for letters, public comments, informing guidance are shared. And also when you see an action by a federal agency, you can also tell your member of Congress whether you like it or not, because there's a relationship between those two entities, obviously, and making sure that there's shared communication about the needs of students experiencing homelessness will ensure the policy is made in better ways.
Great, thank you. So we're going to pause for questions in just a second here, but if you've already seen from this webinar, things happen quickly. We're expecting, again, reconciliation and appropriations to be the two big foci of this particular session of the 117th Congress. But again, things are changing. So Ali, I'll tell you a little bit more about how some of the ways that you can stay up to date on these issues as they evolve.
Yes, okay. So one of the ways that you can see if your member or senator has signed on to co-sponsor a certain bill, or just find out the status of a bill, like what's going on with it, you can go to congress.gov. All you have to do is type in the bill number or the name of the legislation, if you remember it, and it will show you the status. It will show you the co-sponsors and the text, and sometimes summaries if they're available as well. So you can just go there for additional information. So that's quick and easy. You can also check out the members' social media. Members of Congress definitely tend to post like what they're doing on their social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, and you can just keep up to date with them that way, or just know the issues that they're focusing on, and maybe even find out ways to tie certain issues that may seem like priorities for them on social media to the issue that you want to advocate for. You can also sign up for SHC's e-newsletter. We definitely try to provide you all with relevant policy updates and just keep you up to date with like what's going on, so you can look out for that. And also for policy action alerts, we will send those through newsletters as well, but we're definitely not going to bombard you. We typically only send out these policy alerts when we feel or when we know that there is a chance to really influence change, or to get actual impact and influence the decision making of your members of Congress and senators. So you can definitely look out for those, and it will be really helpful. We'd really appreciate if you look out for that, because like we mentioned, like there are a couple of things that are coming up, so you can look out for that. And then also check out our policy page, because we will be posting policy updates there as well. You can also find more information on EFSA. There is a link that is in the chat box right now, that is a subpage of our policy page, which just gives you like more information on EFSA. You can find out all these like other links that I've sent on there as well. And yeah.
And one thing before we turn to questions is to say that, you know, not only are we willing to help make connections between you and your congressional offices, but we're also willing to be there with you. You know, if this were you know, in person, if we were not in the pandemic and doing social distancing, SchoolHouse Connection, we set up meetings in DC when people come to visit DC and actually go with, facilitate the conversation. We're there to kind of make the intro and then to close at the end to make the pitch. We could do that virtually as well. So we're very happy to accompany you on your advocacy journey, in addition to making the connections. And Alian's been doing a great job organizing those visits. So that's something you can let her know directly too. And we'll take before we do a commercial advertisement for our next session, which will be specific tips for communicating with congressional offices, how to set them up, how to prepare, what to do afterwards. I want to take a minute here and stop and see if there's any questions on today's first training, which is really just getting grounded in this new Congress. Any questions either about some of the processes or about some of the substantive issues, anything at all that we can answer for you now? Take a minute to look at the chat box. I don't see any questions coming in. We must have been very, very clear. Or you may be still thinking about questions, but again, please feel free to enter them as Alian will talk a little bit about what's coming up next.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, so as Barbara mentioned, next week we will be discussing how to effectively communicate with Congress. We're going to cover, like we said, the nuts and bolts of communicating with different congressional offices, building relationships with staffers and maintaining them, despite the fact that we aren't able to do in-person visits, because most congressional offices have been switching to and allowing for virtual visits, which have definitely been going great. We've participated in a few of them, and they are just as receptive, and virtual congressional visits are actually expected to continue even past the pandemic. So this is just like a new innovative way, and you don't have to necessarily travel to DC at all to participate in effective advocacy with your member of Congress. You can be in the comfort of your living room, and that's it, and just let them know about what's been happening with you. So we're going to be having two other special guests. I'm guessing this is just a star-studded webinar series. We're going to be having 2 congressional staffers, one from the office of U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski and one from the office of Senator Joe Manchin. And both, I'm sure, some of you, if you're keeping up to date with federal policy, they are pretty important right now. So SchoolHouse Connection is, we're a big deal for having their staffers with us. No, I'm joking. Well, I mean, we are, but yeah, so we're so excited to have them with us, and we hope that you guys join us and you can take something away from this, like as you engage in your advocacy journey. It's just another step and something else to help you all. So it's going to be at the same time next week, Tuesday, February 23rd, and we hope to join us. And you can sign up on our upcoming webinar series page, which is in the PowerPoint, but I will also link that in the chat if you're interested.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, but I want to just, before we close out, I want to thank Jamie and Emily and ask them if they have any other parting words of advice based on their extensive work, specifically advocating on behalf of children and youth experiencing homelessness, but also just in the world of Washington and getting grounded in advocacy for this really unprecedented time in our nation's history and for our children, youth, and families.
Thanks, Barbara. I would just say it's not an experience that a lot of Hill staffers understand. And so making sure that you are the voice for those families is so critical, because it feels distant for a lot of offices. And so making sure that they have a deep understanding of, especially right now, of what families and children are experiencing couldn't be more important.
For sure, I would agree completely with what Jamie has said. I came from a background in a classroom and I wasn't fully aware of the extent of children and youth experiencing homelessness that I am sure were within my own school. And so I think that even if you think the staffer that you are talking to is aware of this challenge or knows that it exists, don't make that assumption. Come in and say your experience, the experience of those whom you work with, and continue to raise your voice, because that is one of the most critical parts in this process, is to continue to bring your voice and the stories of those you work with or yourself to your member of Congress.
Great, thank you very, very much for your help now, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and as long as you'll have us with you. Jamie and Emily. And I just want to close with one last slide, which is a little bit of some links for staying in touch with SchoolHouse Connection through our various social media handles. Again, thank you. This webinar is being recorded. It will be archived and put on our website, so as well as the rest of the webinar series. So you'll have this to share with your colleagues and with others in your community. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you same time next week for part 2 in our advocacy training series. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.